So thank you for coming, and my name is Susan Nagel. I am an associate professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and women's health. So I became interested in endocrine disruption 20 years ago. So I actually came to graduate school to study hormones and behavior. So chemicals like estrogens and androgens, so sex hormones that are responsible for everything from normal development to fertility, to bone health, to immune function, to brain development. But I was particularly interested as a young person in how they affected behavior. And so I actually came here to study that. And I chose a lab based on that. And interestingly enough, that lab never studied behavior again, but we studied hormones and how chemicals in the environment could disrupt normal hormone function. So either by being estrogens or androgens, or preventing the normal action of estrogens and androgens. And so we do think of them as being male hormones, androgens, and female hormones as being estrogens, but it's extremely important in both sexes. So they're not actually really exclusive to males or females. So when we talk about endocrine disruption, then we talk about everyone, and particularly our kids. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So since I study endocrine disruption, when I learned about the process of hydraulic fracturing, about 4 years ago, really, I started to kind of tune into all of the media around hydraulic fracturing for natural gas and oil. And really briefly, probably you guys know what it is if you're here, but if not, just so we're all on the same page, hydraulic fracturing is the process of injecting millions of gallons of water under high pressure underground, usually about a mile, to fracture the underground rock to release natural gas. So we have been harvesting natural gas for decades and decades. And actually, hydraulic fracturing has been around for decades and decades, since the 1940s. What is unique is the combination of hydraulic fracturing, injecting the millions of gallons of water, with tens of thousands of gallons of chemicals under high pressure, with horizontal drilling. So what that means is, instead of just going straight down as a vertical well, it's just what it sounds. You're going down and it's directional. You're turning and going horizontal. And so at that point, then you can actually go for a mile or even 2 miles horizontally under the ground, and then fracturing all along that way to release natural gas from places where we couldn't get natural gas before. And so that's why this process has become so popular, because it's very effective, and it's very lucrative, and it is, I think I just read that we have gone from using about 1%, they call this non-conventional, unconventional drilling. So that was about 1% of our production in 1990, and it's about 20% of our production now, and it will be about 50% of our production in about 10 years. But hydraulic fracturing itself has gone up about tenfold or more in some areas, because it's the only way to extract natural gas from some areas. So I became interested in it because hundreds of chemicals are used in the process of natural gas drilling with hydraulic fracturing. And it's been estimated that about 30% of those chemicals can be endocrine disruptors. So we talked very briefly about what is an endocrine disruptor. So it's anything, any chemical in the environment that can disrupt normal hormone function. So the Endocrine Society started with a page-long definition about 10 years ago, and 2 years ago they decided that it was anything that can disrupt normal hormone function. And so there's lots and lots of chemicals in the environment that are small molecules that can actually be absorbed through our skin, or absorbed when we eat them, or even in some cases absorbed when we inhale them. And so these are small chemicals, just like the hormones that they're disrupting. So estrogens and androgens are very small chemicals, And they also can be absorbed through the skin. We call them lipophilic, so they like to dissolve in fat. So they're really small chemicals. And so many of the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing are also small lipophilic chemicals. So it was estimated that about 30% of these chemicals could be endocrine disruptors. So I wanted to ask the question, can they disrupt estrogens? Can they disrupt androgens? Since that's what I do in my lab. So we set about that. So Chris Casotis, who raised your hand, he's drinking his beer there. So Chris is a graduate student in my lab, and he's actually done all of this work after the very initial water sampling. And so what he has done is actually test the chemicals themselves in the laboratory to see, can they disrupt estrogens or androgens? So before that, it was predicted that they could, from what we knew, but he actually tested it. And he showed in a publication that they could disrupt estrogens and androgens. So, but that's only, yep. So the chemicals that we tested, I'm telling you they're endocrine disruptors. Were they similar to other endocrine disruptors like agricultural chemicals or different? And that's a great question because in fact a lot of them were quite different. So a chemical that we often hear about in Missouri is atrazine. And atrazine is an endocrine disruptor because it interferes with the production of estrogens and androgens. It actually increases the production of estrogens and decreases the production of androgens. So it has been associated with low sperm count in men because it decreases their testosterone level. So the chemicals that we studied ended up inhibiting the action of estrogens and androgens, by and large. So they might have a similar effect, but they're doing it in a different way. So it's a subtle point, but so they're similar yet different, I guess. So the question was, is glyphosate an endocrine disruptor? And that is one of the active ingredients in Roundup. And so that was the question. And absolutely, it is an endocrine disruptor. And there has been very little study, actually, on glyphosate. But it's detected in most people in places like Missouri and in breast milk, for example. And there's starting to be much more interest in studying the endocrine disrupting effects of glyphosate. Good. So just to move on to some more of our work. So we kind of answered the first question in a way. The first question was testing 12 chemicals, and since then Chris has extended that to 24 chemicals, and he's extended that to 3 more receptors. So what that means is 3 more types of hormones. So we've tested our chemicals on 5 types of hormones, and with 24 different chemicals. And so by and large, what he's finding then is endocrine disruption of many types. But the short story is that most of the chemicals he tested could interfere with one of those 5 hormones. So the next question is, all right, they're used in hydraulic fracturing. Okay, so what? So our next question was, are they changing the quality of water in places where hydraulic fracturing is used? And so what we did to just begin to answer that question was to go to a place where hydraulic fracturing is used extensively in Garfield County, Colorado. So there's about 10,000 natural gas wells in Garfield County. And what we did was to reach out and connect with landowners who had had some kind of accident or spill related to hydraulic fracturing. So what we wanted to know was, under the worst case scenario, where we know that something bad has happened, does it change the quality of their water? And what we were asking specifically was, does it change the endocrine disrupting activity of the water? And so in that case, we were looking at the estrogenic and androgenic activity of the water at these spill sites. relative to places that had not experienced a spill. 2 other sites in Garfield County that had not experienced a spill, and then actually here in Missouri, the Missouri River and the Hinkson Creek, and then a deep well at the USGS just south of town. So in short, what we found was that that the water, surface water, so like from creeks and ponds and rivers, tended to have about 2 times the activity of sites that had not experienced a spill in Colorado. And that activity in that surface water tended to inhibit the normal action of estrogens and androgens. And if you'll remember, that's what I said our chemicals tended to do. We also tested groundwater, and we found that it also had even greater activity, 2 to 3 times the activity in groundwater, the endocrine disrupting activity in groundwater at those spill sites as here in Missouri or at places in Colorado that had not had spills. So this was a initial study. We had about 7 sites. It was about 40 different water samples. And what we're interested in doing now is extending this to a much bigger geographical area, a much greater number of samples, to our 5 hormone receptor types. And so what we want to do is ask the question, what about places where there are not spills? So if we will resample at sites that have spills, but what about just at normal places? And the reason that we're interested in doing that is that, 1, spills are very common. So last year there were about 500 spills in Garfield County that were reported. The other thing is that the integrity of this natural gas well is dependent on a cement casing, and that cement casing is just inherently fragile. And so over the course of a well, where you're talking 30 to 40 to 50 years of a producing well, those wells those concrete casings tend to fail. And so it's been estimated that 2 to 6% of those casings fail immediately, and up to 50% fail within 30 years. So other researchers have looked at things like the presence of methane, natural gas, in water wells. And so in this case, this was in Pennsylvania. And what they showed was that the closer you live to natural gas wells, the greater the concentration of methane was in your drinking water. The further you got away, it lowered to background levels. There is some methane in water when you live in some of these geological regions, but it dramatically increased, 10-fold and even 100-fold in some cases, greater concentration. So what we're interested in then is measuring kind of this background level of activity in Garfield County, where there is a wealth of natural gas wells, and we want to know, well, what's happening just normally? And the reason this is important is because this is becoming so common and so popular. It is all over the United States, and for that matter, all over the world. So about 30 states out of 50 right now use this process and are harvesting natural gas. All of our neighbors actually are using hydraulic fracturing. You might ask, do we have hydraulic fracturing in Missouri? And in fact, we do not. And that is just a coincidence that really there's only just a little tiny segment over near Illinois that we have a shale play, and it's just really barely touching Missouri. But Illinois has very dramatically increased their amount of hydraulic fracturing. So I just want to talk a tiny bit about some of the things that we experienced when we were in Colorado. So we got to know a lot of people when we were there and that lived in this area and have always lived in this area. And it was actually really one of the most moving things of my career. the stories that we heard of these folks who had been living in this area that was rapidly developing over the last 20 years was really quite profound. So we had one individual that had, for several decades, a hunting operation up on the Rhone Plateau. Beautiful, beautiful, pristine area that has a huge amount of hydraulic fracturing. And so, for example, he came up one winter, or at the end of winter, one spring, to open his hunting guiding cabin. And he had driven up, and he was hot, and he got out of the car, and he had a ritual that he would throw his stick out into the pond for his retriever to go retrieve. So he did that, and dog went out and came back, and he went in and turned on his tap and filled up his cup of water and started guzzling it down. When he realized that his throat was burning, he got about half of it down, and he set it down, and he immediately started having tremors and felt very ill. He was able to drive himself back down off of the Rhone Plateau and check himself into the emergency room. And long story short, he has suffered a tremendous number of ailments, from seizures to memory problems to tremors that won't go away. So once again, long story short, what was found was that above his property, there was about 30 wells. And when one of the trucks that was emptying the wastewater from hydraulic fracturing, so the wastewater being, if you inject millions of gallons of water into the ground, then that water comes back up. Some of it comes back up quickly, and some of it comes back up over the life of the well. And then that contains both natural components that are meant to be a mile down, and some of them very toxic, and then all those chemicals that were injected into the ground to aid the fracturing. So one of those trucks had, the valve had been left loose, and so the whole contents of the truck, and this was told to them actually, not off the record, but had been left open and leaked out, overnight. And so they had very, very high concentrations of fracturing chemicals in their water. And this was water from a spring that was right there on their property. And he feels like his dog was poisoned by this, and his dog died about a month later. And it's completely anecdotal. However, it was, when Chris tested the water for toxicity, which we haven't really talked about. We've talked about endocrine disrupting activity, but everyone can relate to toxicity, something that causes cell death. What's your name? Mariana? Mariana asked, even if they know it's bad, why do they keep doing it? Would anyone like to answer that question? You think it's an obvious one, and I think a lot of people do think it's an obvious one. And I think it is I don't want to diminish it, actually. It is a extremely complex system that we live in. It's not, it makes a whole lot of money. I'm sorry, okay. So the first question was our political and social environment, economic environment in regards to funding for scientific research. Good question. Because ever since the sequester, and really probably before that, there has been in real dollars, there has been a decrease in funding for scientific research, and it has actually pretty much the course of my 20 plus years in this field, it has gone down. So funding for science has gotten harder and harder and harder to get, and so as I tell my graduate students, that is really, sadly, my job. It is to bring in money to the lab. That's what we do. So it has gone from funding about 20% of applications for NIH funding to funding 5 to 8% maybe of applications. So it just makes our job tougher. And so I think that was a bit of a leading question, that we are doing other things. Certainly we are looking at funding from foundations. I am, as many of you have seen on your little cards, conducting a crowdfunding campaign to raise money to just get the initial data from our next study to help us get that 5% of funding from the National Institutes of Health. And that's really what it takes, is to have actually done most of the work for your study to get funded by NIH, to prove to them that it's a really good idea and that you can do it. And so that's what we want to do with our crowdfunding. And the last part of that question was, would I encourage young people to go into science? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it is one of those things that obviously I am very passionate about, and if you're passionate about it, I think it is it's the best job in the world. So the question was, is it possible to connect the dots with the Missouri Right to Farm bill, energy, and what I'm doing? That's a hard one. It is, I mean, everyone knows that it is a very, the climate for farming is conducive to large-scale farming. And that is increasingly the only way to make a living because of subsidies, because of the way that we farm with a huge number of chemicals, frankly. Am I aware of any filtration techniques that separate out endocrine disrupting chemicals? And so if you're talking about our drinking water, there are certainly just some of the carbon-based filters will absorb those. That's actually more or less what we use in the lab to concentrate out the chemicals. They will bind to that carbon-based filter. But if you're talking about for treatment of the hydraulic fracturing waste, there are increasingly interest in doing that. I was actually just meeting with 2 civil engineers from the University of Missouri today that are very, very interested in addressing that question. One was from a biological degradation pathway using bacteria and algae to break down these chemicals. Another was using a kind of filter, yeah, a very compact, very efficient filter. So the comment was, if you filter them out, then what will you do with them, because they still have to go somewhere. So the emphasis is actually on degradation, and so chemical degradation and biological degradation, so that they're actually neutralized. Well, currently there is very, very little treatment of hydraulic fracturing wastewater. It is beginning to be recycled. Because it's a problem for the industry. I mean, of what do you do with these millions of gallons of water? So it's starting to be recycled, but it can only be reused a limited number of times to to frack a new well. And so, I don't know, Chris, to my knowledge, there's not a lot. I mean, treatment right now, there is very, very little, if any, treatment going on. Our water treatment plants are absolutely not designed to handle these types of chemicals. So all of the things I know about are up and coming. I don't know. Do you have a different answer, Chris? Yeah. Chung Ho, do you have a different answer?
There are a few options. One is more like engineer, physical and chemical treatment. Also, University of Minnesota also developed biological treatment. They encapsulate the microbial degrader in the silicone gel. So for this purpose, also there is some other option of large-scale bioremediation strategy has been developed, but none of them have been ever validated as far as my knowledge.
So the comment was, right now it's being treated as toxic waste. Yes and no. It's not actually being given that much respect, I think, or regulation. largely. So regulation now is mostly dependent on a state-by-state basis of this process, and most states are underfunded and understaffed and have an inherent conflict of interest when it comes to regulating this process. So it is not, it is regulated, but the regulations are light, and relative to other toxic waste, it receives many exceptions. Does any amount of fracking chemical cause harm to human beings? So are you asking, is it okay to be exposed to a little bit? I mean, I'm sorry?
One molecule.
So the short answer is we don't know. What we do know is that hormones like estrogen work at very low concentrations. So in the part per billion range and lower. So part per billion is 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So these chemicals work at very low concentrations. So we have no systematic epidemiological studies of this process largely on human health. The ones that we have had, they've looked at birth outcomes, the closer you live to hydraulic fracturing, and found an association with 2 types of birth defects. And both of these studies were in Colorado, and the other one was looking at adult outcomes, and overall they found an association with negative outcomes, and particularly cancer. So that's one of the things that I guess, is what I always say is that this is an extremely understudied, huge human experiment. We're exposed to chemicals every day, and a lot of them are bad, and a lot of them cause endocrine disruption, and a lot of them cause cancer. So are these any worse than those? And yes and no. We are exposed to hundreds, thousands of chemicals every day. I would make the assertion that the magnitude of the volume of chemicals that we're using in this process is kind of unheard of. So I mean, I think the jury's still out. But it is how we regulate chemicals in this country that we have to prove there's harm, not that they're safe. So now we will be testing that question on everyone now. We're studying the thyroid hormone, progesterone, and glucocorticoid. So glucocorticoid is involved in the immune system, normal immune functioning. Thyroid hormone is involved in every way that we use energy and essential in normal brain development. So one thing that I said we would get back to and we didn't was actually why this is important for children and babies. And the reason why it's important is that we need hormones to develop normally. And so we know if you're hypothyroid, if you don't have enough thyroid hormone during development, that absolutely decreases IQ in kids. So so that's thyroid hormone. Progesterone then is essential in normal reproduction. So the ability to get and stay pregnant. I think probably everyone heard that. But so what can people do? What can we do? Right. So I mean, I think one of the things we can do always with anything is vote with our pocketbooks. The other thing that we can do is absolutely communicate with our legislators, both at the state and national level. And there, Monta Welsh is here from People's Visioning, and she is reminding me that there are local groups that are interested in this issue as well. Is there a safe fracking? No! I don't know the answer to that. That's why I'm studying this. So the question was, we've talked a little bit about the hormone disrupting activity. What other types of activities do these chemicals have? And so I did touch on the neurotoxicity, so altering brain function, so being extremely bad for our mental functioning. And that's a huge class of these effects, is neurotoxicants. Another class is just carcinogens, so they do cause cancer. So the chemicals that they're using, we actually know a whole lot about them. They don't have to tell what the chemicals are, but there has started to be a lot of voluntary disclosure about the chemicals, and there are also independent laboratory assessments. We have with us actually Dr. Chung Ho Lin back there in the corner, who's a fantastic analytical chemist, and he has looked. Yep. He is looking at the water and looking for the individual ingredients of our water samples now. So we know a lot about these chemicals and their ability to disrupt pretty much any body system that you can think of. These are chemicals that are typically highly regulated when they come in contact or can come in contact with things like surface and groundwater. But in this particular case, hydraulic fracturing is exempted from most of or parts of most of the ways that we traditionally keep our water safe in this country. So the ways that the federal government uses the Environmental Protection Agency to monitor our water and the water quality, it has a very weak ability to do so in the case of hydraulic fracturing. Let me see if I can paraphrase. So there are many other effects other than chemical contamination of water. So one of the very it's not well studied, however, it's better studied than most anything is the air pollution associated with hydraulic fracturing. So both from all of the trucks required to bring in those millions of gallons of water and chemicals and sand, and then take away all of that waste. Methane itself is a very potent greenhouse gas, so 25 to 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So in that case, while it burns cleaner and has been promoted as an alternative green energy, the process of taking it out of the ground releases huge amounts of methane that has largely been ignored. And then I think your other point was about earthquakes. So I'm actually from Arkansas. My parents are here. Shout out for my parents. So there is a shale play in Arkansas and this is a place that had, to my knowledge, all growing up, I mean, there were no earthquakes in Arkansas. This is an area that actually where I went to college in Conway, just north of there are now dozens of earthquakes every day. And so this has been linked by the U.S. Geological Society survey to hydraulic fracturing events, and particularly to one of the ways that we deal with the waste of hydraulic fracturing is to actually inject it back into the ground. So in wells that have been abandoned, deep wells, let's inject it back into the ground. And so that type of activity has been particularly linked to earthquakes. However, others are now coming out just looking at the process of fracking itself and stimulating earthquakes. So all in all, the point just being, I think, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, there are many types of impacts other than just water quality. So the question, if I can paraphrase, was about the proprietary nature of the chemicals used in the process. So as I mentioned, they are proprietary, and so there is nothing that compels them to tell us what's in the mixture. Now, there has been pressure both at the national level and others to release that information. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of voluntary disclosures. It does impede our ability to do research if we don't know what we're studying. On the other hand, one of the reasons we went with the approach that we used of measuring hormonal activity or total hormonal activity is kind of a bioactivity. And so in that case, you don't actually have to know what the chemicals are that are responsible. And so it was one approach that we could take without knowing what chemicals were responsible. But yeah, it absolutely confounds the entire study of this process. And do you have a second part of that question? So the question was, do I work with the chemical companies, and has there been any, backlash from our work? Certainly, when we published our initial work, there was a lot of there was a lot of interest on the web, and a lot of that was in discrediting everything that we had done. And so there were immediately blogs that came up that gave the top 5 myths about our studies, and then a couple days later it was the next top 5 myths. So there was absolutely a huge effort to suggest that everything we had done was not valid, great question. So what advantage do the endocrine disrupting activity, the chemicals, provide for the process? So the chemicals are used for a whole variety of reasons, from reducing friction to inhibiting microbial growth. They aid the process. A lot of them we don't know what they do, frankly. I mean, some of them published have been things like instant coffee. So we don't always know. But the point actually is that they are only coincidentally endocrine disruptors. And thank you for asking that. They're not used because they're endocrine disruptors. And that's, as a field, endocrine disruptors are only coincidentally because they are these small lipophilic molecules that they kind of look like estrogens and they kind of look like androgens, that they can trick the body. So the question is, how long do they last in the environment? And so most of these chemicals have kind of a medium half-life. So most of them are, and I should defer to my expert over here Chung Ho is our expert on this, but he has given us actually a lot of information on this. And so it's really on the order of days generally. Some of them can last for weeks, and some of them only for hours. But in general, they're kind of medium, what we would consider medium persistence in the environment. So we're testing a hypothesis that the endocrine disrupting activity that we saw was caused by hydraulic fracturing. And we found an association in our first study, and so the question is, well, was that just a fluke? It was a small study. So now we will go back and test many, many more sites with very high quality analytical studies to identify the chemicals responsible for the endocrine disrupting activity, to test whether to either prove or disprove our hypothesis. Well, actually that's support or disprove our hypothesis. Why don't they have to disclose? Exactly what they're pumping down into the earth. Well, I guess the short answer is the 2005 Energy Policy Act. So the question was, would I recommend the documentary films Gasland 1 and Gasland 2? I would recommend them. They are educational, certainly. They are also, of course, designed to get people to watch them so they can be a little sensational. On the other hand, I think there is a lot of good information in both of those films.
If there are no more questions, please thank me. Thank you.